Okay, good morning, Catherine. I think you're seeing my screen. Are you seeing the slides?
We see the Zoom right now.
All right, give me 1 second. How's that?
Perfect.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Catherine. Thank you for inviting ISO New England. I'm Eric Johnson, Head of External Affairs at ISO New England, and happy to share the stage with Caitlin and Jamie as well. There are three things that the ISO is responsible for. We'll focus today mostly on the third of them, but on the left-hand side, grid operation, we have been operating the bulk power system in New England since 1997. Those are the high voltage transmission lines in the region. High voltage is typically 115,000 volts or higher, or 115 kV. We also administer wholesale markets, and we are essentially providing a platform for buyers and sellers in the marketplace. So the ISO doesn't buy or sell electricity directly. And then the third area is power system planning. And we look out 5 to 10 years to make sure that we have a plan for the transmission system to serve what we anticipate to be the demand for electricity in the region. And our planning horizon recently has extended even beyond the 10-year horizon as we think about lining up our work with the policy goals of the states, particularly around electrification. So there's some things we don't do as a wholesale market administrator. We don't have responsibility or control over the retail electricity system. That would be under the jurisdiction of the states, and in Massachusetts, that would be the Department of Public Utility. In the power system, we operate the power system, but we don't own the power grid infrastructure. The only thing we own are the control center and offices in Western Mass and a backup facility in Connecticut. The I in ISO also means we are independent of the companies, meaning we have no financial interest in any of the companies that participate in the wholesale markets. You may hear the ISO talk about fuel, and we certainly need to have situational awareness about the fuel system that supports the power generation in the region, but we only have jurisdiction and control over the electric side. We don't have jurisdiction over fuel. We don't manage the procurement of fuel for any of the resources in the region. And then when it comes to the siting of new infrastructure, whether that's generation or transmission, that falls under the jurisdiction of the states. Typically, a siting board would manage those applications. And then finally, when we think about the resource mix of the future, I'll talk about how that's changing, but we don't plan what the resource mix will be or should be. So the markets are a key determinant of what types of resources come forward, and the states have a key role in shaping the incentives for different types of resources. So when we think about the electric grid, this is the map of New England, and it's not showing highways, but it's showing the transportation system for electrons around the region. And I mentioned our network is 115 kV and larger. That would be the red lines on the map. You can think of those as like state highways. And then the blue would be the higher voltage, 345,000 volt lines that carry most of the power across the region. New England is a region with about 30,000 megawatts of generation internal, so that'd be on this map. But we also have ties to Quebec, New Brunswick, and New York, and we are a net importer of electricity. So we have enough resources here to meet our needs, but we always use the lowest price resources, and sometimes those come from other regions. When we think about the primary job of the ISO, which is the reliability of the bulk power system, we operate under reliability standards that are set by the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, or NERC, and then we're part of the Northeast chapter of NERC, the Northeast Power Coordinating Council. And so reliability standards would specify things like making sure you're not overloading the transmission system or allowing too much power to flow on the lines. And I'll give you an analogy. If in your home you have too many things on at one time, in the kitchen, the microwave, the coffee pot, and suddenly you trip a circuit, that's designed to keep the wires in your house from overheating and burning down. On the bulk power system, there are not circuit breakers. So it requires a system operator to make sure that we plan the system on a day-to-day basis so that we're not overloading any of the equipment. Because when power system equipment overloads, it can overheat, lines can sag, they can make contact with the ground or vegetation, and then you have a really serious problem. So the work we do falls under pretty significant reliability standards set by NERC and NPCC. So you will often hear the ISO talk about the tariff, and the tariff in our terminology is the set of documents that have been approved by our regulator, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC. And there is a provision within our tariff that deals with markets, and there's a provision that deals with transmission planning. And so if you hear references to Attachment K or the regional system planning process, that would be the ISO tariff. That would be totally separate from the use of the word tariff when you're talking about tariffs on imports between two countries. That's not what we're talking about here. When we think about the planning process in New England, we have a stakeholder forum called the Planning Advisory Committee. It's an open forum for anybody who wants to learn about the study work that is underway at the ISO. So you have a couple of options. You can view the materials online. You can join the meetings, which are virtual. We do have one restriction on participation in the PAC, which is if we're discussing information that is critical energy infrastructure information, or CEII, that information is restricted to people who have CEII access. And if you ever have a question about whether or not you're able to obtain that, please feel free to reach out to me, and I'll help you think through that. So at the end of our year, we put together a regional system plan. We do this actually on a biannual basis, and the last RSP was in 2023. We're going to be working this year to put out the 2025 regional system plan, and that's a public document that basically highlights all of the study results over the past year or two. And we also hold a regional system plan public meeting, which is an open meeting with no restrictions. Anybody can join in person or virtually. So when we think about system planning, those activities that fall under that third area of responsibility for the ISO, it's really kind of two things. Resource adequacy is, do you have enough resources connected to your transmission system to serve the energy needs in the region? So for resource adequacy, we spend a lot of time forecasting what are the demands of 15 million people in New England over the course of the year, different seasons of the year. In New England, we're a summer peaking system, so we want to make sure we have enough resources to meet the summer peak demand. And you can't just have enough to meet the demand, you need to carry operating reserves on top of that, because things break or resources go offline unexpectedly, and we want to make sure that people have power even when that happens. We administer an interconnection queue as part of the planning responsibilities, and there's a big number of changes that I'll talk about with the queue process. On the right-hand side, transmission planning, this is looking at the high voltage lines specifically. So we do what we would call needs assessments and determine whether or not the transmission system can serve needs over the 5 to 10 year horizon. More recently, we've been working with the states to look at ways to plan transmission to meet public policy goals. So not just to making sure the system's reliable, but can we serve the electrification demands that the states have in their public policies, as well as the decarbonization objectives. So I'll talk about that in a minute. So when we do forecasting, we have a report in the industry, we refer to this as the Capacity, Energy, Load, and Transmission Report, or CELT, and it's essentially a library of the forecast and assumptions that go into our system planning study. So it's a great reference document. It's public. If you want a list of every generator in New England, it's in the CELT report. If you want to know how much Massachusetts is going to use for electricity each year over the next 10 years, that's in the CELT report. So it's a great information resource. So when we think about forecasting, I mentioned that we're a summer peaking system. So on the left-hand side, you can see we develop a base forecast, but on top of that, we forecast electric vehicles and heat pumps. and we can subtract behind the meter solar. So we come up with what we would say would be the net forecast for New England each year over the next 10 years. This is just one snapshot. So our forecast in 10 years in the summertime is we will be just about 27,000 megawatts. And for reference, earlier this summer, in the end of June, we're just over 26,000 megawatts. So we'll see growth, and largely due to electric vehicles. If you look on the right-hand side in the winter, you can see that we're typically lower in the winter now, comparing the two base cases. But the heat in the middle of that right-hand side is the electrification of buildings, converting from fossil fuel-based heating systems to heat pumps, which pull power from the grid. So we're going to see a system where the winter peak kind of catches up with the summer peak, and then beyond the mid-2030s will become a winter peaking system. And all of that is driven by assumptions about electric vehicles and buildings being electrified. So I mentioned interconnection process. We have historically studied every proposal to connect to the grid in the order that they apply to the ISO. And our regulator has made some pretty substantial changes to that. And in fact, we won't be going through the sort of first come, first serve approach. We'll be moving to first ready, first serve, and we're going to be studying projects in what we call clusters. So if there's a number of generators that want to connect in one area, we'll study them all together rather than one at a time. We think that'll be a more efficient way of looking at potential new resources, and a way for the new resources to share in the cost of potential upgrades. So when we think about the queue process, this is a very basic look at this. So top left, the interconnection request comes to the ISO. They give us sort of the basic information about their project. It might be a small modular reactor in the future. Today, it could be offshore wind. Until now, it's largely been natural gas-fired generators. So they're giving us the mechanical and engineering information about that project. Under this new FERC order, we'll study them in a cluster, and that will identify any upgrades that are needed for the interconnection of those new resources. And before anybody can connect to the grid, there needs to be an interconnection agreement between the ISO, which signs off on the reliability of that project, the interconnecting transmission customer, and the developer of the project. And they can't go to construction until they've completed those processes. And this does not include siting, as we mentioned. So there also be requirements to go to the state siting board and get any approvals, as well as any DEP or EPA approvals in order to interconnect. So this is a snapshot of our queue today, and look back in the 2017 timeframe. So a couple big distinctions. The queue is a lot larger right now, almost 40,000 megawatts versus 13,000 megawatts. But the makeup of the queue has changed. So years ago, it was largely natural gas, but on the right-hand side, you can see there's almost nobody proposing to build new gas-fired generation in the region. And several years ago, battery storage didn't really show up in the queue, and now we're seeing it's just about the largest category of resources. So those would be short-duration lithium-ion batteries. And we're also starting to see grid-scale solar show up in the queue, not just rooftop solar. So that's a snapshot of the queue over time. We do expect that this queue will shrink as the requirements of FERC Order 2023 go into effect, and that'll probably make it a little bit more efficient for us to study projects that have a better likelihood of moving forward. I'm going to skip over a couple of these slides, but there is a short video in this presentation if you want to look a little bit more at the transmission planning system process in New England. But there are basically three types of projects we look at. One is transmission that's needed for reliability, as I mentioned earlier. System efficiency projects, formerly known as market efficiency upgrades. If we see that the cost of building transmission would be less than the cost of congestion relief in the system, we can plan transmission that way. Although we really haven't seen a need for that. Congestion in the New England system has been very, very low for many years. The third category is the emerging area public policy projects. We do have the ability to plan transmission to meet the goals of the New England states. And I'm I'm going to jump ahead a little bit here. So the transmission planning process in New England now includes a feature called longer term transmission planning. And what does longer term mean? Well, I mentioned we plan the system out to 10 years. The state said they wanted us to look out to 2035, 2040, 2050, because that's sort of the end state for a lot of the electrification and decarbonization goals. So we've done some analysis in close coordination with the states, and the states are the New England States Committee on Electricity, or NESCO. The first transmission study was the 2050 study, and it identified a number of overloads on the transmission system if we electrify, as we talked about in the forecasting slides. And so now the states have prioritized developing some transmission in Maine that would allow us to move more power from Maine down into southern New England. And so this is all happening under a new framework called longer term transmission planning. We presented this to FERC. FERC approved the concept. And we actually have the first RFP for this process is open. We issued that this spring, and we're going to be evaluating proposals that come in starting in September. So there are links to the determination from NESCO, and I think you might find that an interesting development in the transmission space. So we will spend the next year after the proposals come in evaluating those projects. And so by the end of 2016, we'll have some more insight on how the future transmission system could look under this LTTP framework. I wanted just to highlight a couple of areas where we work with the states, not just for transmission planning in New England, but there's a Northeast Collaborative on interregional transmission, and our engineers and planning team have been involved working with the states to support that. There's also a Northeast International Committee on Energy, which is the New England governors and Eastern Canadian premiers, so looking at expanding electricity trade in the Northeast. ISO New England has long been a sponsor and supporter of the NICE committee. And I mentioned LTTP, and I'll just finally mention that the states have sought funding from the U.S. Department of Energy, and we've provided technical support as an advisor to the states in those funding applications. So we do transmission planning through an open process. I'd encourage folks to follow up with us if you have any questions about how to get involved. The 6 states are actively involved in this process. We're excited about the first ever RFP for longer term transmission, and stay tuned for more changes for transmission planning, because there's an additional FERC order that will require some changes for how all ISOs do transmission planning. And I'll pause there. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Eric, for presenting. That was very informative. So we do have one question from someone at DOER working on a straw proposal for energy siting and permitting that includes public health, safety, and environmental standards. A question came up about standards around overhead and underground transmission lines, and they were curious if you have any feedback about underground transmission lines.
There are underground transmission lines on the bulk power system. They tend to be in the urban areas, so you don't see poles and wires in Boston. So all of their circuits, and by circuit I mean transmission line, are underground. There are some portions of Southwest Connecticut where the state required transmission to be underground, and so that was put into place as part of the Southwest Connecticut Reliability Project. But in most cases throughout New England, it's overhead, and it's really a matter of cost. It's much more expensive to put transmission lines underground. It's actually a different technology. We don't just bury the lines, and so we kind of plan the system to meet the reliability standards. In the urban areas, it tends to be underground circuits. And of course, we work very closely with the electric utilities in each of the states to figure out how do we put the most cost-effective solution in place.
Thank you for that. We have another question about offshore wind. The question is offshore wind in particular taken into account in the studies, and if there's anything of concern?
Well, offshore wind is um, probably the one resource that has the most potential for new growth in New England. We've been doing studies since 2010 to identify the potential for offshore wind, and New England has about 26,000 megawatts of demand right now. Um, we see that there's potential for 10,000 or more megawatts of offshore wind. And the nice thing about offshore wind is that it's pretty close to where the demand is in the region. So you're only going 50 miles offshore Massachusetts. The resource is producing electricity most of the time. Offshore wind tends to be produce more electricity per unit than onshore wind because there's always a sea breeze. So we have studied offshore wind for many years. We've signed off on the interconnection of Cape Wind, Block Island Wind, Vineyard Wind, Revolution Wind. So there's a lot of wind projects that have been included in our studies. And we also model offshore wind in the economic studies that we do as part of system planning as well. It's referenced in the slides. I didn't get into it, but yeah, we do a lot to take into account the potential for offshore wind in the region.
Thank you. Yeah, and somebody asked about this, but we'll be posting the slides to the Office of Energy Transformation website, so folks can take a look again after as well. So another question is on EVs. So you highlighted EVs as a key load forecast driver. Would you be able to expand on the EV growth forecast?
Yeah, so if you look at the CELT report, and the CELT report comes out every year in May, if you look at the gross forecast, it's the forecast of electricity used for everything in the region. Then we have a separate forecast that looks at EVs. And what we do is we take data from a lot of public sources, information from EV manufacturers, information from state officials on what their policy goals around electric vehicles are. We don't have any sort of special insight on EVs, so we try to draw from the states and from industry. And we develop a forecast. And then each year we look at things like registrations of new vehicles. So for this past year, we found that registrations were coming in slower than the previous year's forecast. So we made an adjustment, but we're still showing long-term growth of electric vehicles. And I think the question with EVs is how quickly is our region going to adopt EVs? Usually in a public setting, I ask people to raise their hands, do you drive an EV? And there's a few. But when we get out into the 10-year time frame, we expect a lot more hands will be up in the air. And it's really a bunch of individual choices that determine how quickly that demand is going to grow in the region.
Right. And then actually very related to this, someone asked about the graph of electricity demand in 2035. Why is the electricity demand for EVs higher in the winter versus the summer?
I think that the batteries require more electricity to stay charged. I think it's the efficiency of the technology.
Makes sense. A follow-up to the offshore wind question. So does bringing offshore wind onto the system require no transmission expansion? Was the follow-up?
Well, it certainly would, because there's no transmission offshore unless the developer builds it. So a Vineyard Wind, we've planned transmission to connect that resource. We did the same thing for Block Island and the same thing for Revolution Wind. So yes, the interconnection process in New England identifies the upgrades that are needed. But if you're talking about offshore wind, you're not just talking about an upgrade. You're talking about building new cable underwater to connect to the transmission system. There are concepts for building out an offshore wind network for transmission, like a superhighway. They've talked about that in the Northeast, all along the East Coast. It doesn't exist yet, but there may be a time when there's transmission out there and then developers can connect to it as they come online. But right now we're connecting transmission to specific projects, and we've got a great lineup of speakers today, and they probably have some more insights on the interconnection of renewable resources as well.
Yeah, thank you. So one last question for now. Do EVs and BTM best count only as load in your consideration or as resources to be drawn from as well?
That's a good question. So an electric vehicle or a behind the meter battery, we wouldn't see those as an asset in New England. They're too small to connect to the grid. They certainly would be seen by your electric distribution company. If you had a lot of EVs and you had a retail rate structure where those resources could be aggregated together, you could potentially offer that to the grid, but one car by itself is probably not going to connect to the ISO system. But there certainly would be potential, and if you're going to add a lot of demand through EVs, I think we should be thinking about how do we think of that electricity demand as also a resource to balance supply and demand in the future. So I think we're going to get there.
Thank you. That's all the questions we have today. I know that was a lot, so thank you very much for the presentation and for answering all those questions. I think very interesting and very relevant to the work that we're doing in this fog, helping us get there. So
thank you for having us.
Thank you. So I will pass it now to Jamie.
All right. Thank you, Catherine. Good morning, everyone. I'm going to try and share my screen here. So yeah, I'm excited to be a part of the conversation. Give me a thumbs up, Catherine, if that's looking good on screen. Good? Great.
Yes.
Awesome. So yeah, I'm pleased to be a part of the panel today. My name is Jamie Dickerson. I work with Acadia Center. I serve as our Senior Director for Climate and Clean Energy Programs. Some of you guys might be familiar with us. We're based in Maine, but active across the whole New England region and the Northeast writ large on a whole host of policies and program areas, including the grid, like we're talking about today. So yeah, I'm going to dive right in. I have been pretty ambitious with a number of slides I want to try and cover, so it'll be a bit of a lightning round, but I'll try and leave as much time as possible for Q&A. Very big, important, and very broad topics that we've teed up for the agenda today, so lots to get into. So before I dive in on transmission and transmission planning and interconnection reform, I wanted to address some of these upfront threshold questions, like what peak are we talking about, and also how high will that peak be based on the actual drivers of demand. When we're talking about today's peak in 2025, as Eric alluded to, we got a great example of this just a couple weeks ago on June 24th, which might be the annual peak for this year. The graph here is from an analysis that we did that shows how much distributed solar was contributing, both sort of behind the meter and more front of meter to meeting those peak demand needs and avoiding some of the real high costs and emissions on the system. But that was just one example. Again, it's a summer peak. It's about 25 or 26 gigawatts of net demand. But contrast that with potentially the peaks that we might see in 2050, which some of the studies we've looked at could average about 55 gigawatts of winter peak demand in the future. Again, after we make the switch from summer to winter in the 2030s sometime, peak could grow quite considerably. And the biggest driver of that out to 2050 would be electrification of space heating and cooling, the blue wedge on the right side of the graph. The studies do, at least the CECP in Massachusetts, found that there would be quite smaller peak impacts from transportation electrification by 2050. So now I do put a question mark on this, particularly because I think there's some ways that we can trim down this peak, but in particular, the role of grid flexibility. Some of the studies that we've scrutinized recently for the New England region estimated on average about 7% peak demand reduction capability from demand response and grid flexibility in the future. But actually, it's really exciting, some of the modeling coming out of New York, that future grid flexibility potential could surpass even 20% of seasonal peaks by 2040. You can see some of the resource types that would make up that significant of flexibility in the middle there. So some of you guys have heard me talk about this before, but just to say, we shouldn't just assume that peak is fixed and immovable. We have a lot of levers to actually reduce peak before we begin to decarbonize it. And I know the focus area working groups, the big Excel sheet, the Excel framework that you guys are working on does have a good policy screen tab where you list demand side resources. So I just would really just encourage that to be moved up to be the first tab in some ways in terms of the first lever that we should be pulling before we talk about generation. Before I dive in, I just wanted to sort of give this everything everywhere all at once slide. It's a little bit daunting, but just to make the macro point that if it's tough to keep track of all the moving pieces here, it's because there are quite a lot of moving pieces in these respective domains. The top row is really focused on transmission planning, everything from regional to interregional, national and international even, and Canada as well. And then on the bottom row, everything distribution system focused in terms of the electric sector modernization plans in Massachusetts, all of the interconnection policy forums, and of course this Office of Energy Transformation process that we're now all engaged in, not to mention all of the gas transition work that's going on at the DPU as well. So I'll try and make connections between these buckets as I go. So this is just sort of a summary of some of the key takeaways and recommendations I want to touch on. I think at the biggest level, the highest level, when it comes to transmission planning and decarbonizing the peak, these planning activities will help us unlock a wider set of available clean peak resources for us to be able to call upon during periods of peak stress, both today and out into the future. I really want to emphasize a lot of the interregional nature of that planning today. I think there's a big opportunity that's not yet being fully tapped to better integrate the full Northeast US and Eastern Canadian regions. But that's true within the 6-state region as well with LTTP and Order 1920, as Eric mentioned. There's other big opportunities to really improve some of the oversight of asset condition project proposals in the region, specifically with an eye toward hosting capacity, getting resources online, future-proofing those investments so that they can meet future peak needs as well. And on the interconnection reform side, again, the biggest headline message I want to convey is these reforms will help bring new clean peak resources online quicker, more affordably, and in the time frame that we need them, both for resource adequacy and for reducing the emissions content of our peak demand period. So this encompasses things like flexible interconnection standards, modifying the operational schedules of resources so that we can avoid the cost prohibitive worst case system upgrades that might prevent projects from coming online. There's a really big distribution and transmission level nexus here that I want to get into as well in terms of aligning our distribution interconnection planning activities with some of the so-called affected system operator study activities at the regional and transmission level as well. So let me dive into transmission planning first. Again, I'm going to try and cover interregional down to local and the intersection of T&D within our region. Starting at the interregional level, just again to go back to the heat wave a couple weeks ago, I just wanted to observe that there were major imports from neighboring regions relied upon in the evening hours of June 24th, which was the period of highest net demand and cost. So more than 3 gigawatts from 5 p.m. on. So when real-time prices were exceeding $1,000 per megawatt hour. So already we benefit from the connections that we share with neighboring regions, but that could be expanded quite considerably potentially. And if you're also looking for an example of, how the heck can transmission, avoid the need for a peaker? It was actually a local transmission upgrade that was able to allow for the safe retirement of Mystic Generating Station in Everett a few years ago with the Ready Path project that Eversource and National Grid completed. Mystic is, quite a complicated plant for a variety of reasons. Maybe not your prototypical peaker, but just to make the case about how these transmission system investments relate to the reliability requirements that sometimes keep peaker plants online. So to zoom out again to the macro view of our grid, so often we're focused on either just Massachusetts or just the 6-state region. It's easy to forget that we're actually part of this broader NPCC, Northeast Power Coordinating Council footprint, which Eric alluded to under NERC. This includes most of Eastern Canada, I think 70% of Canada's population, in fact, but also New York and the New England region. So a lot of these jurisdictions share aggressive carbon reduction goals. There's major opportunities to increase the amount of bidirectional or even omnidirectional electricity trade across this footprint, north to south, south to north, east-west and vice versa. So some of you guys may know that we've been working on the Northeast Grid Planning Forum, NGPF, for a couple of years now. This is really trying to spur just this, which is like, a new concerted effort to do joint planning and coordination at a transmission level across this broader footprint, so that we're planning in a unified fashion rather than in a fragmented and isolated fashion across these respective balancing authorities and grid operators. This is a nice map of all the transmission infrastructures that exists in the region. I won't dwell on it, but you can see some of the seasonal transfer capacity between the different regions. And yes, we'll definitely make a copy of the slides available so folks can get out their magnifying glass and take a look at some of the lines on the map. But this is sort of the more conceptual map, just to illustrate some of the complementary resources that exist in this region. And again, keep in mind that the transmission is about unlocking and integrating these resources so that they can complement one another in a greater fashion. This includes sources of generation, both existing and new, sources of storage, like the significant hydro storage reservoirs north of the border in Canada. And it includes major new sources of potential clean power, including power that will be clean peaking in the future, such as the offshore wind potential, not only off New England and New York, but notably off Nova Scotia and Newfoundland and Labrador as well. Just to highlight Nova Scotia, I mean, there's more than 100 gigawatts of technical potential of offshore wind capacity off of Nova Scotia. We're really excited that even among that, tens of gigawatts is expected to be very low cost, shallow water, fixed foundation offshore wind development. And geographically, it's actually quite proximate to New England compared to some of the hydro facilities in Quebec that we already get some power from. So that's a major opportunity area to highlight in terms of transmission helping with future clean peak. So there's a lot of words on this slide, just to sort of put an emphasis on why this matters for decarbonizing the peak. Again, expanding the market for new resources, sharing costs so we can bring these resources online in a more affordable manner, reducing congestion, curtailment, some of the price cannibalization that can happen when you've got too many resources within one region, unable to spread their wings and go beyond to neighboring regions. So the quotes at the bottom of the slide are really from, I think, either the 2050 Decarb Roadmap or the CECP in Massachusetts, I forget which, but just emphasizing some of the factors that are driving these benefits, including maybe most notably weather diversity, in terms of building a grid that's bigger than the weather, so that even when there is a shared storm system that's moving across the Northeast, the sheer geographic size of this grid footprint can help us withstand that and share the benefits of surplus clean peak resources among neighbors. So there's been a ton of momentum on transmission planning, interregional transmission planning recently. Eric touched on some of these. It's kind of interesting. We've got New England and Eastern Canada with the NEG-ECP and the NICE committee, which is amazing to have reconstituted. And then we have East-West. We've got New England, New York, and some PJM states working on the Northeast States Collaborative on interregional transmission. Our vision is just to integrate the two together and bring the full NPCC footprint into proactive, coordinated transmission planning. I mentioned Atlantic Canada offshore wind. I won't mention that again, but also some promising work on offshore wind equipment and supply chain, which is sort of where we have to put our focus these next few years, unless and until we can have a breakthrough on the federal offshore wind posture these next few years. So I did want to offer an exciting preview. In the next few weeks, we are going to be finalizing and submitting a new interregional transmission planning roadmap for Eastern Canada and the Northeast US. This is going to be a roadmap commissioned by the Northeast Grid Planning Forum, by NGPF, from Power Advisory. I'm going to zoom through some sort of preview highlights of this study, but more reading to be done soon, and this will be submitted to the NICE committee to help effectuate their duties. It's actually pretty similar to the process that Eric outlined for the current ISO New England process, but fundamentally the neighboring regions are going to have to get together to identify needs, to design projects and select them, and then to agree on allocating costs between the respective jurisdictions. There are differences among the provinces and the states in terms of vertically integrated utilities and restructured markets. So there's going to have to be some creative and sort of multiple procurement pathways depending on the location of particular lines. And it's going to require a lot of trust building, coordination, information sharing on the alignment of assumptions and inputs for our future load forecasting, for example. So it's going to take some work, but I think it will yield just immeasurable benefits for the macro region. And to leave you all with a couple of examples of where this has been done effectively, I think within the U.S., MISO's LRTP, Long Range Transmission Plan process, has a lot of promising elements to learn from. And oftentimes the gold standard that's often pointed to is the ENTSO-E framework in Europe with their TYNDP 10-year network development plan. If they can do it across 36 European Union states and a continent where 2 world wars were fought, I hope that we can do it here in the Northeast US in the coming years. So that was a lot on interregional, but just to touch on the regional, which Eric already covered, LTTP is really promising the ability to unbottle some of the renewable capacity in northern Maine above the north-south interface is going to be really critical to helping the southern New England load pockets more effectively meet their peak with clean resources. So excited about that. Just recently, again, we've seen some of the price separation that does occur between Maine and the rest of New England because of those transmission bottlenecks. So if anything, I would just highlight that in terms of Order 1920, we're excited about the benefit category of mitigation of extreme weather events and unexpected system conditions, which do tend to correspond pretty closely to periods of peak demand. So we're excited about evaluating transmission proposals for that particular benefit. I couldn't resist the urge to talk about asset condition projects just briefly. This is worth 30 minutes by itself, but our view is that the current process for scrutinizing asset condition project transmission proposals is unfortunately woefully lacking. We're talking about a pipeline of ACPs in the region through 2030 that could be about $6 billion. We really need some functional independent transmission monitor, we believe, to for example, make sure that if we're going to spend $6 billion or some share thereof, that those investments are right sized for hosting capacity, for new renewable resources, also for load growth and things of that nature. So I'll resist the urge to go deeper there for now. So interconnection, pivoting, but obviously highly interrelated with transmission planning. These are some of the topics I want to get into in the next few slides. These are some of the sort of innovative policy solutions that seem to be emerging. I'm going to focus more on the state level distribution system interconnection, and Caitlin's going to focus more on wholesale transmission level interconnection. But at least at the distribution level, flexible interconnection is really promising. Again, I mentioned it's about modifying a solar project or a battery project's operational schedule so that it can benefit the project, but also benefit the system and not sort of trigger these fault issues or overloading issues that can sometimes otherwise require costly system upgrades. This includes both planned, contractual, and in the future, more operational, real-time curtailment via new software platforms like DERMS, Distributed Energy Resource Management Systems. So I'm excited about the prospect for this, both for new generation and for new load. I know Governor Healy's affordability bill includes both generation and load, so that we can get both sources of new customer connections online faster. Within the LTSPP, the longer-term system planning process in Massachusetts, not to be confused with LTTP at the regional level, we're really seeing an exciting new pathway coming soon for proactive planning and distribution system investments to increase hosting capacity for distributed generation. I'll touch on that on the next slide. There's also been new reform areas new reforms in the area of cost allocation in terms of shifting away from the applicant who breaks, the straw that breaks the camel's back has to bear the full financial cost of a network upgrade. Instead, allocating costs among multi-beneficiaries of upgrades, including not only interconnecting customers, but ratepayers at large. If a new substation gets put into place, that could benefit ratepayers. Also, some new exciting proposals for common system modification fees for smaller projects to really simplify what the prospect of interconnecting looks like for them. I did want to take 30 to 60 seconds to really highlight the federal tax credit phase out as a big issue, looming issue here, though. Obviously, interconnection approvals is always a big question of timing. How soon can we make this happen? And now we have projects that are trying to navigate the interconnection process with the sort of Damocles hanging in the future about whether or not they will miss the cliff of expiring federal investment and production tax credits. So it's going to be absolutely essential for us to work as a region, as ISO New England, as transmission operators, EDCs and interconnecting customers to try and be creative so that projects don't die on the vine late in the stage of an interconnection study because of a missed federal tax credit. So just in terms of Massachusetts activity, the electric sector modernization plans, ESMPs, were a really promising development and in some ways very exciting next step in terms of the grid modernization efforts of the utilities in Mass. The initial planning was more focused on planning for load growth rather than planning for, adding new hosting capacity specifically for distributed generation. There's some added headroom via, investments for load increases, but I think what we're talking about next in terms of following the recent order on the ESMPs, turning attention to a hopeful new formally adopted long-term system planning process, which would provide the opportunity for the utilities to propose distribution system upgrades specifically to increase DG hosting capacity proactively. And very importantly, before the 2030 ESMPs come in every year will definitely matter. So it's also a platform for, again, maybe reacting to new directives for the utilities to establish that flexible interconnection paradigm in a fulsome manner, as I mentioned. I won't dwell on all these sub-bullets here, but we did try and give a little bit of a repository of other notable recent state examples that folks can peruse when they check out the slides after the fact. California has a new limited generation profile interconnection export schedule process that they just adopted. New York has done some interesting things on cost sharing as well. And related to interconnection, although slightly different, New Jersey has a new bill on instant permitting for small DG projects, which could offer a model for really expediting these projects on a broad basis. So again, there's lots more that we could get into. I'm going to leave Connect and Manage SIS to a little bit more to Caitlin, although I will mention just briefly that the grid enhancing technologies provisions in last year's climate bill in Massachusetts does offer a pretty promising pathway to scrutinize interconnection solutions to, again, increase throughput or understand that we have greater headroom than we might previously assume through things like dynamic line ratings and beyond. So I think my last word on interconnection, I know I'm running up against the clock here, is really to talk about these affected system operator studies. There is a new provision, as I understand it, within FERC 2023 compliance that is going to provide a very slightly brief window, I think in the fall, if I have this correct, for distribution level projects to be notified about whether or not their impact on the system is going to be triggering these regional or transmission system affected system operator studies. So again, it's another complicating factor and a knock-on effect in terms of the federal tax credit eligibility that we really need to be laser focused on. And the broader message here is that the distribution system upgrades that we're talking about are large enough to be spilling up onto and affecting the transmission system. So we really won't get anywhere if we try and plan these separate systems in silos. We have to really do integrated planning across the T&D scene. So I will skip my fun permissionless balcony solar slide for a Q&A if there's interest, and leave it there for some questions with my thanks.
Thank you so much, Jamie. That was really interesting. A lot of information, but I think a lot of it was very relevant. I appreciate that. So I'm waiting for questions to come in from FOG members, so please submit your questions if you have any for Jamie. In the meantime, I have a question of my own to start us off with. So I think you kind of alluded to this, but regarding the technical potential of offshore wind off of Nova Scotia, is this opportunity impacted by any of the recent federal policies, or is it more of an opportunity? And then do we have the transmission bill today to use that generation in the region?
Great question. I could have planted that question, so I appreciate it. So yes, I mean, it is a major opportunity. There would be some potential impacts, but we're talking about in terms of the federal posture right now, but these are projects that would be in Canadian or international waters, so they wouldn't be subject to, the U.S. Bureau of Ocean Energy Management leasing process. Instead, actually, the Canadian federal government recently passed a law to commence this new leasing process for offshore lease areas off the coast of Nova Scotia and Newfoundland and Labrador. So that could go forward. there, to your second question, there is not yet sufficient transmission infrastructure to bring gigawatts of new load from Atlantic Canada either to other parts of Canada or to New England and New York. So that would have to be part of a proactive procurement effort. And a new line or a new series of lines would need a presidential permit on the U.S. side if it's going to cross the border. That might come, who knows, maybe 5 or 10 years down the line. So it very well might not actually be required in the next 3.5 years in terms of the current policy environment. But it's a perfect example where, again, hundreds of gigawatts of technical potential. I think the local load in Nova Scotia is like, I don't know, 2 to 5 gigawatts on peak or something like that. It's like massively outsized generation compared to the local demand. And that's where transmission comes into play in terms of opening up a pathway for those electrons to be able to get to a bigger 10 and dozens of gigawatts market in terms of peak demand in New England and New York.
That's really interesting. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Another question I had, you kind of went over this kind of quickly, and I was interested to learn a little more. So I believe you called it ENSO. So can you speak more to what ENSO accomplished and what that changed in Europe?
Sure, absolutely. I'm going to pull my slide back up just for my own reference here. So yeah, ENSO-E, I forget when exactly it was established, but I'm also forgetting the what the acronym stands for. But the key mechanism that they've put forward is the TYNDP process. These are 10-year network development plans. Again, they're trying to plan their macro grid across 36 European Union member states. And this is the process to identify cross-border projects that could facilitate decarbonization, help with reliability, minimize costs, things of that nature. So it's a very collaborative process. There's information sharing, there's common data assumptions and data practices that are adhered to by all the transmission system operators in the different nations. And this is helping build things like offshore wind interconnectors in the North Sea between and among some of the Scandinavian states and between and among the UK and Ireland, as far as I'm aware, and France, but also terrestrial lines as well. So again, it's held out there as a really strong model for the collaboration among, again, a very large number of multiple planning entities and transmission system operators, but in a relatively proximate geographic footprint.
Thank you. We have a question from a attendee. So is there a move to bring subsea cables to get the Atlantic Canada power into the US? There's been a Maritimes of the Northeast project a few years back to do this. Is that reinvigorated?
I think that concept is definitely having new wind in the sails, pardon the pun, recently, precisely because of this shift in the U.S. offshore wind policy environment and the need to tap into similar resources that are reasonably close by. I think there would be multiple pathways in terms of the transmission routes to get that power to load. Could be terrestrial lines east-west in the Canadian provinces. It could be a sort of a southwesterly subsea cable through the Gulf of Maine. I think there is an emerging interest in having like a single backbone line through Stellwagen Bank in terms of in the Gulf of Maine that would avoid some of the most important fisheries areas, but also some of the most ecologically sensitive parts of the Gulf of Maine. And that type of a subsea corridor could really provide the opportunity not only to bring Atlantic Canada power to New England, but potentially also pre-build it in sort of a mesh-ready type of way, such that future Gulf of Maine U.S. offshore wind resources could plug into that backbone apparatus or backbone line, in the slightly more distant future in terms of the policy environment again. So yeah, I do think there is renewed interest around that concept, and I know Governor Healy's team recently was quoted in some Canadian press about expressing interest in that resource. So yeah, we're really excited about that being, again, a part of this fulsome complementary resource portfolio across the whole region.
Thank you. So this question they mentioned might be for any of the panelists, but we'll start with you, Jamie. What role do you see innovative technologies like storage, GETS, and others playing in the transmission build-out? How are they currently considered, if at all?
Yeah, great question. We're really excited about GETS. I will admit, a little bit frustrated by the lack of fulsome embrace in terms of the policy processes that are in place to require consideration of GETS, but that is changing. Last year's Massachusetts bill, for the first time, required some due consideration of GETS. I think a Connecticut bill, similarly, especially for certain projects going before the state siting board in Connecticut, are going to require review and consideration of GETS. But essentially, in the broadest terms, it's about getting more juice through the wires and the infrastructure that we already have on the system. If you think about something, again, as I mentioned, like dynamic line ratings, we're either operating on static or ambient adjusted ratings for most of our transmission lines across the region right now. And that flows into all of our modeling about and assumptions about, what the impact of a new interconnecting customer might be. And so if we had more dynamic line ratings, for example, we might be able to know that in the future, for future winter peaks, when it's really cold and when there's a lot of wind, those wires actually might be able to withstand more throughput in a safer, under safe conditions. And therefore we might have more headroom to accommodate new clean peak resources at that time. So GETS are definitely part and parcel to this conversation, both for transmission planning and for interconnection reform, I would argue.
Thank you. Just want to give a chance for the other panelists, if you have a response. The question was, what role do you see innovative technologies like storage, GETS, and others playing in the transmission build out? No worries if there's no response.
I'll just say, and I don't want to take from Caitlin's time, we did a GETS day with the ISO's Planning Advisory Committee. So there's a content that we shared and had a discussion with our stakeholders recently. I'll drop that into the chat for anybody who's interested.
Thank you.
And I'll try to talk about GETS a little bit when I'm going through my slides.
Perfect. Well, that's a perfect segue. So that's our last question. So I think I'll hand it to you, Caitlin. Thank you very much, Jamie. Really appreciate the presentation.
My share. Are you able to see my, oh, sorry, and I'm not at the beginning of it. Are you able to see that?
Yeah, we're seeing the slides.
Great. Well, thank you, Catherine and broader team for inviting me to join this discussion. I will try not to be too repetitive from the content that Eric and Jamie have already covered, and hopefully offer some different perspectives. And as Jamie said, I will be focusing a little bit more on the interconnection side, sort of on the ISO process and the bulk system. But I will start with just a brief overview of Advanced Energy United for anyone who's not familiar with our organization. We are a national association of businesses driving toward 100% clean energy across the US. We do research and analysis, and we really work on informing policies and regulations to enable rapid deployment of advanced energy technology. We are active in states across the country, as well as at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission and in several of the regional transmission organizations and independent system operators. That is the work that I am a part of at United, and I also happen to be based in Massachusetts. So this topic is especially near and dear to my heart, although I do work in ISO New England, PJM, MISO, and SPP are the areas that we cover. So I'll try to bring some perspectives from those regions into this topic as well. And then United also has some federal engagement at Congress and some of the other federal agencies. And our work is really heavily informed by our member companies that span a range of different technologies and business models, from large-scale renewable and storage to small distributed scale resources, demand response, energy efficiency, vehicle electrification, transmission development, grid enhancing technologies, and more. So we bring all of those perspectives into our work. I spend a lot of my time thinking about transmission planning and interconnection reform. broadly and how it's essential for the energy transition, for deployment, cost-effective deployment of advanced energy resources and reliable electricity, but a little bit less of my time thinking about how it impacts peak decarbonization. So I did spend a few minutes thinking about that specific nexus ahead of this discussion, and wanted to remind myself kind of where are we today with New England's peak, and it is quite carbon intensive still. This is the same day that Jamie was talking about that I'm sure is seared in the memory of New Englanders of very hot weather that we had about a month ago, and the peak of that peak day was supplied by 74% carbon emitting resources. So as I'm sure this group is very familiar, there's a number of different studies of how the region will decarbonize that result in a very different grid mix than we saw on June 24th and that we see in general on our grid today. And under any scenario, I think that Jamie discussed the importance of peak shaving and solutions that don't involve generating resources. But in any scenario, I think we see a very different resource mix that's going to involve deployment of a lot of new capacity, both storage and renewables, to meet electricity needs both sort of in every hour of the day and at the peak specifically. And all of those resources are going to have to be interconnected to the grid and ultimately deliverable to customers. And that is going to require a higher pace of deployment than we've seen in recent years. These numbers are from last year's EPSET study that ISO New England did, but they show thousands of megawatts per year on average build out of renewable energy and storage. So, renewables operating both on and off peak and charging storage and storage both short and long duration, which I know the working group had discussions of during a previous session, are going to be critical for peak decarbonization, and that will all require transmission build out and an efficient generator interconnection process. So I really think of these tools as enablers of both decarbonization generally and peak decarbonization, and thought that this visual from ISO's Future Grid Reliability Study was a nice summary of how we need to be thinking about these processes slightly differently, and how we are asking them to do something different than we've been asking in the past as we move from a system with a smaller number of larger generating units that can often be located closer to load centers to a more distributed system with more resources of different operating characteristics, more just volume of projects to move through the interconnection process, as well as range of different operating characteristics that have to be studied as part of that process, and then different transmission needs, and often more transmission needed, sort of longer distances between these resources that are located where the resource is to load centers. So pivoting to transmission reforms first, and thinking again about how transmission specifically supports a cleaner peak. And I think we've touched on some all of these in the prior presentation, so I'll go through them relatively quickly. But unlocking access to resources, clean resources across New England, as well as storage, both battery and long duration storage, importing resources from Canada into the region, expanding connections with neighboring grids to allow both import and export during times of lower load, and that's important to make those resources more competitive and provide, reduce curtailment and increase their capacity value and revenue streams for the renewables that we have in the region to enable them to serve other regions when needed. So this slide tries to summarize a lot of activity on transmission planning, both in ISO New England and by the New England states and by FERC over the recent years. This does not even capture everything. I think the main takeaway here is just that there has been a lot of progress made on how we plan transmission. I think really reflecting a recognition both by the New England region and by FERC that we need to be thinking more comprehensively, more long-term, more holistically about how we're planning transmission. So in New England, that started with the New England States Vision Statement that Eric referenced, and ultimately the 2050 transmission study that ISO New England published a few years after, but that really resulted from that collaborative effort between the New England states and the ISO that identified a number of kind of no regrets transmission needs that showed up across various scenarios, as well as identifying opportunities for significant savings if the region reduces the peak that we are ultimately planning for. So another sort of tie-in to how all of these issues need to fit together. And then the LTTP reforms, the long-term transmission planning reforms that both Eric and Jamie referenced, are really how that planning process kind of becomes ultimately real lines that can be planned, identified, scrutinized, and paid for by the region. And so that was approved by FERC right around the same time that FERC was issuing its own requirements in Order 1920 that requires all regions to conduct long-term multi-value scenario-based transmission planning. So ISO New England will also face a requirement to comply with that order while it is implementing its LTTP reforms and working on the first LTTP request for proposals that went out in March of this year. A few other that's the long-term regional planning and sort of progress that's been made around regional planning. A few other things that have been going on kind of at the same time in parallel. A number of other initiatives that FERC has started and in many cases not taken final action on. There was a transmission cost containment technical conference that really looked at issues including how are we scrutinizing and evaluating local and asset condition projects and what would be the role of an independent transmission monitor. A lot of good discussion there that has not gone anywhere yet at FERC, but as I'll talk about in a minute, is sort of an active conversation in New England and actually also in the MISO region. FERC also got a lot of comments and held a workshop on interregional transfer capacity. And I don't have this on the slide, but NERC also did their interregional transfer capability study. And FERC took comments on that. So potential for additional FERC action, but again, something that the region is also working on. And then again, related to the local and asset condition projects, in December of last year, there were a group of consumers that filed a complaint to FERC about lack of oversight of locally planned transmission. So a number of things sort of swirling at the federal level that we have yet to see what the priorities of the new commission when new commissioners are seated and a new chair is named, what those priorities will be. But the region has certainly been working on a number of these same issues at the same time. As mentioned, the region is considering an asset condition reviewer that's been proposed. Really, I think kudos to the New England States Commission on Electricity, NESCO, for identifying the challenges that the states were facing from the rising cost of these asset condition projects and the lack of real oversight and scrutiny that they were subject to. So that is sort of an active discussion of what that reviewer will look like in New England. And then on the interregional side, there's been a lot of efforts that I think Jamie covered really well, and I won't go into too much detail on here, among both the Northeast states as well as broader groups. And as one example of that, the Northeast States Collaborative on Interregional Transmission recently issued a request for information for potential projects. So thinking about what are our priorities moving forward on transmission planning, really following through on that LTTP RFP that, as Eric mentioned, project selection will happen by September of 2026. That is a huge opportunity for the region, and I think a really great example of how the states and the ISO have come together to recognize that we need to be thinking about transmission a little bit differently, given the challenges and sort of the transition that we're facing. Order 1920 compliance, ISO has requested a fairly lengthy extension to be able to work on the LTTP as their top priority, but will be filing in June of 2027. So that's an opportunity to look at what additional priorities and progress can be made through compliance. And I've linked to a brief document that Advanced Energy United put together about what we see as some opportunities in Order 1920 as the region decides how this should best dovetail with LTTP. Ensuring efficient transmission spending. We know that that there is a need for transmission investment, and so it's vital that we make sure that we're spending consumer dollars as efficiently as possible. And so, as mentioned, this asset condition reviewer is being actively discussed, and there could be opportunities to consider, both what is the optimal role for ISO New England as the asset condition reviewer, and are there additional items not in scope for the asset condition reviewer, but that would be more of sort of a full independent transmission monitor role that the region should also be working toward. And then finally, interregional transmission planning, following through on existing efforts that I think Jamie covered really well in his presentation. Then moving to interconnection reforms, and again, thinking first about how interconnection supports a cleaner peak. I think really bringing more resources online more quickly and cost effectively. We are, as this graphic kind of shows, we are asking the interconnection process to do something quite different than what it was historically designed to do, which was connect a very small number of mostly natural gas plants. And now it's being asked to connect a very large number of resources that are not just natural gas, but wind, solar, battery storage that have different operating characteristics, and just a completely different volume of projects that are going through this process. So a more efficient interconnection process that reduces uncertainty will lower costs and increase completion rates for proposed projects. And also, we need to be making it feasible for new types of resources to make it through this process that, again, has been now adjusted to reflect some of the new resources that are coming onto the system, but we need to be continually thinking about how different resources are operating and how that should be reflected in the study process. So interconnection remains a really challenging bottleneck for bringing resources online. I think some of these challenges have been improved or will be improved by the implementation of FERC Order 2023, and I'll get to that in a second. But I think some of them still are areas for continued opportunity, continued reform. So lack of interconnection capacity or headroom on the system, and these aren't just unique. These are not necessarily specific to ISO New England. These are generic challenges with the interconnection process, but lack of, for a project developer, reliable upfront information about the cost and how long it's going to take to connect. Often overly conservative identification of necessary network upgrades, and then just resource constraints on the part of, well, really on all sides of the equation that make the process slow, and all of these, lack of information upfront can result in oversubscribed queues, slow studies, and ultimately withdrawals and restudies that add more time to the process. Order 2023 was important an important step to address or reduce some of these challenges. And so here's a timeline of that process. And I've got this all in one column for this slide because most of this is kind of driven by FERC, and then ISO New England has been responsive to FERC's directives. So FERC issued Order 2023 in July of 2023. ISO New England filed its compliance with Order 2023. And I will just pause to say that, as mentioned at the beginning, we are active in a number of different regions. ISO New England, I think, had the most robust stakeholder process for Order 2023 compliance. Advanced Energy United was able to work with other stakeholders and with the ISO to make what we view as a few important improvements over the requirements of Order 2023. So in some important ways, ISO New England's filing is better than Order 2023, including some flexibility for projects to make small adjustments to size to reduce really costly network upgrades and avoid withdrawals that would be more disruptive. Sort of mid-process on the Order 2023 compliance process, when plans had been submitted, FERC recognized Order 2023 is progress, but there's a lot more that we should be talking about and thinking about with interconnection reform. And so they held a 2-day workshop to look at reforms beyond Order 2023, which I'll come back to in a minute. And then the region is now working with a new schedule to actually implement Order 2023. So FERC took a very long time to issue an order on ISO New England's compliance filing. That did cause ISO to have to push back the studies a little bit, but ISO was moved quite quickly, very quickly, once the order did come from FERC to adjust transition timing and try to minimize disruption to projects trying to make it through that process, which, as Jamie noted, with respect to the federal tax incentive changes, is really critical to get projects that are currently under development through the transition and through the cluster studies as quickly as possible. And so that means that ISO New England is planning for full implementation of the new first ready, first served cluster process in 2026. Just to briefly sort of talk about what we've accomplished with Order 2023, I think ISO New England is moving. Some regions had already moved to a cluster process. ISO New England with Order 2023 is making that transition to a cluster process, which should make the interconnection process more efficient. It, as Eric alluded to, disciplines queue entry and discourages parking projects in the queue with things like withdrawal penalties and deposit requirements and site control requirements to enter the queue and to meet certain milestones. It gives greater schedule certainty via deadlines and penalties on the transmission providers, and adds flexibility and requires consideration of grid enhancing technologies to reduce upgrades for some projects. It does not do everything to make interconnection as efficient as it could optimally be. So it doesn't address the need for more comprehensive transmission planning, although hopefully Order 1920 takes up that issue. It doesn't address the staffing and resource challenges or ensure adoption of best available software and automation tools. It doesn't take up some of the sort of related processes like surplus, generator replacement, and energy resource interconnection service. It focuses more on kind of the cluster process, and doesn't address delays or cost overruns after the interconnection agreement is signed. Recognizing that I think I'm right up against time, I will just reference this paper that we released from the Brattle Group and Grid Strategies that looks at what should come next from Order 2023. And there are a number of recommendations coming out of that to continue working in some of these other areas. And then some other regions have taken action on some of these other reforms, such as embracing automation and AI. I will say in most cases, this is very much work in progress, but there are some exciting initial results about how much these tools can speed up the process Surplus interconnection service has been really important in regions like MISO, where there is a flexible SIS option that's resulted in a lot of storage, in particular, being added to wind and solar. That, of course, can help those resources to contribute more meaningfully to peak. Some regions have taken sort of innovative or interesting approaches, such as SPP's consolidated planning process. That's kind of an entry fee model that integrates transmission and interconnection planning and gives projects entering the queue more certainty about both their cost and their time to connect to the grid. And then CAISO, for example, uses remedial action schemes and many other transmission providers in the West as well. And then sort of on the negative side, some regions have implemented fast track processes that discriminate amongst resources. So PJM has their Reliability Resource Initiative. MISO and SPP have proposed expedited study processes. These are intended to bring certain resources online quickly to meet resource adequacy gaps, but they are highly disruptive to other projects that have been waiting in the queue in many cases for years, and could sort of undermine confidence in the process and dampen future investment. And we have thankfully not seen ISO New England turn to these kinds of solutions. And I think that sort of maintains the integrity of the cluster process that the region is moving toward. So I think that's really it. I think I talked about all these conclusions already, so I can, I'm a couple minutes over, pause here for any questions.
Thank you so much, Caitlin. No worries on time. I think that was very informative. So we do actually have one question that's related to one of your slides just a few slides ago about AI. So can you comment on the implications of the explosive interest in data centers to support AI?
Yeah, so I think from it is definitely driving a lot of demand for more electricity. I would say particularly in regions like PJM and MISO, and I think that's why we've seen some of these regions pursue these fast track processes. New England, from the various studies I've seen, is not a region that's expected to experience an explosion of AI-driven demand growth. I think the demand growth in New England is still anticipated to come primarily from building and transportation electrification, but in other regions of the country, it is certainly a huge driving concern, and I'm sure New England will not be entirely left off the AI race. But I do think that has implications for how what neighboring regions are experiencing and what the opportunities might be to export. I will also briefly mention some people may have seen a recent DOE study coming out of an executive order identifying regions with anticipated resource adequacy shortfalls. I think we have a lot of questions and concerns about some of the assumptions that went into that study, but notable for this region, New England was among a small, I think it was New England and maybe parts of the West, maybe New York, were the only regions that didn't have anticipated resource adequacy shortfalls. And a lot of that really was driven by assumptions about AI demand growth, as well as really conservative assumptions about resource entry.
Thank you. So one other question about interconnection queue timelines. Do renewables have different typical interconnection queue times versus fossil fuels? I know there's a small, as we saw in Eric's chart, small percentage of new fossils queued to enter the interconnection queue, but I was just curious about that.
Yeah, so they will all be studied in the new cluster process as part of the same cluster. I believe there may be differences in completion times after the interconnection process, but I can't speak to sort of how that stacks up. I do know sort of on a going forward basis that there are a lot of supply chain concerns really for all resources getting built, but I think in particular, gas turbines face significant potential supply chain shortages and delays to getting the equipment once they've gotten through the interconnection process. But in terms of the process itself, everyone studied kind of in the same cluster timeframe.
Thank you. And with that, I think naturally as the last presenter, fewest questions left. So that's all the questions we have for today. So thank you so much, Caitlin, and to our other presenters, Jamie and Eric as well, for lending your time this morning and presenting to our FOG members. I think it's very helpful for gaining that baseline understanding of transmission planning and interconnection for our efforts to help with decarbonizing the peak. So really appreciate it. And thanks everyone for tuning in.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a great day.
Bye all.